Back in the summer of 2013, he traveled to Norway for 3 months as part of a work project. His employer's sister company over there was in need of welders to install a new piece of equipment in some government buildings. It paid well and he'd never been to any of the Scandinavian countries, so he volunteered himself. The only problem was that he had to stay in a little cottage in a pretty remote village on the outskirts of Bergen. It was a beautiful place, but dreadfully boring at nights, with nothing much to do except sit around watching television. He shared the house with a couple of other guys, but they were a good bit older than he was, so they never had much to speak about. To pass the time at nights, he'd take walks around the village, which was made up of beautiful cobbled paths that led into little side streets and alleys. The soft summer rain would trickle down the old buildings, and that smell of wet brick put a smile on his face as he wandered around those streets. The place was a ghost town after 10 p.m. The only bar in the village shut early, and after that, the locals would disperse home. It was serene. He'd take these walks nightly. Even after the sun set and darkness took over, he felt safe in that little place. It was like a child's picture book. It was as if nothing bad had ever happened there. Boy, was he wrong. The rain was getting stronger, he said. He had passed by the old church nearly every night on his walks, but never thought to look inside. That night though, the door was slightly ajar, and he swore he could hear a soft chanting from the inside. He remembered looking at his watch and seeing that it was a few minutes after the stroke of midnight. That soft summer rain had developed into a much fiercer one, so he figured he can sneak in and take shelter. He craned his neck around the corner of the heavy wooden door, and the chanting seemed to stop abruptly. "Hello?" he called out, his clothes dripping as he stepped inside. The only sound there was the tapping of the rain against the stained glass windows. He stepped forward, inspecting the surroundings for a sign of life. "Hello?" he called out. "Is anyone there?" Surely the priest must have been there. He approached the candles on the altar. The wicks hadn't been burning the wax down for long. Someone had to have lit them recently. He realized that there were no other doors in that old church, no adjoining buildings or rooms which shot off from the wall where he stood. The only way in and out was that heavy wooden door. Had he imagined that chanting? That's when he heard the voices. A low whisper made him flinch. It sounded as if it had come from inside his own head. Was that the wind whistling through the windows? He thought. It hardly sounded human. Another deeper whisper. He could feel his skin crawl, each tiny hair on the nape of his neck standing up and freezing in position. Who's there? He turned to the left, right, nothing. Sounded in that low, whispery unison. He couldn't pinpoint the source. It was so low and crackly, like an old television stuck between channels. He knelt down and looked under the pews. If someone was screwing with him, they had to have been kneeling behind one of them. He lowered his head parallel to the wooden floor, his cold cheek touching the coarse wood. His eyes darted from left to right. Nothing. He jumped to his feet quicker than he knew he could. It felt like a hole had opened up in his stomach. It felt like he shouldn't be in that place, like something was trying to make him do something he knew he shouldn't. Two distinct, gravelly noises, pain and anger. They were aimed at him, he could feel. He began to back out the room, keeping ever alert for the slightest movement. If someone was screwing with him, then they had been successful. He could hardly breathe. He was that terrified. As his hand touched the door, he heard the voices one last time, much lower and angrier than before. He ran all the way back to the cottage through the pouring rain, not once looking back. He burst through the door so fast that he nearly took off its hinges. He stripped those wet clothes off and dived under his covers, feeling like a scared 5-year-old again. "What the hell were you doing last night?" He lied, telling him that he was running like a man possessed because of the torrential weather. The housemate replied with a joke about him being the only Scotsman who was afraid of the rain. He then told him about his walk and going to the church, but not about the voices. His housemate's face contorted into a twisted grimace when he mentioned he'd went inside. "The locals don't go in there much," he whispered to him. "Not after what happened to those children." He went on to tell a story about two young altar boys and a priest from the 1980s. He told him that this priest had done things to those poor kids, told him that if they had mentioned this to anyone else, they'd spend eternity in hell. This apparently went on for months, the unsuspecting townsfolk happily going to church each Sunday, that smiling priest preaching the Lord's word while those young boys stood by his side, terrified. Got to the stage where they couldn't bear it anymore. They ended it themselves right there in that church rather than risk going to hell. Left a note about how sorry they were. That sick man was arrested soon after. Ended it? He made a gesture with his tie, lifting it above his head to signify that the kids hung themselves. Are you kidding me? No. You think I'd make something like that up? The whole experience was bouncing around in his head the whole day. He could hardly concentrate. He just stood around with his welding mask, pretending he was busy while those horrible voices replayed in his ears. "Hey, say up!" He froze, turning his gaze to a young woman on the platform above us, holding a camera. "Say up!" She repeated with a smile on her face, gesturing to all the workers to gather. My colleague put his arm around my neck, pointing up at her and smiling. "What is she saying? What does that mean?" "Say up," he stammered, the previous night's words hitting him again like a locomotive. "She's saying say up," he smiled, turning his head to face her as she snapped a picture. "It means look up."